For 20 years, I've restored broken pieces of history, thinking I knew how to fix anything. But at 2 a.m., I heard my husband laughing with his mistress about my hoard of ancient trash. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to sell my father's soul to fund his luxury life in Paris. He thinks I'm just a fragile old woman clinging to the past. He's about to find out that some things, like justice, are best served cold, and with a legal iron fist. Let me tell you how it all began. The house was quiet in the way only a California craftsman bungalow can be at 2 in the morning. The kind of silence where the oak floors remember every footstep they've ever held. I came downstairs for water, nothing more. My throat was dry from the Santa Ana winds that had been rattling the windows all week, and I padded through the hallway in my bare feet, past the row of restored Victorian frames my father had collected before I was born. I almost didn't hear it. Almost. But then Julian's laugh cut through the dark like a blade on glass. Low, ugly, and dripping with the kind of contempt you only use when you think no one important is listening. I stopped at the edge of the study door. It was cracked open just enough for the blue glow of his laptop to spill across the hardwood. He was on FaceTime, leaning back in my father's leather chair, the one Dad had reupholstered 3 times because he said good things deserve second chances. And there she was on the screen, Vanessa, 28 years old, lips inflated to the point of parody, framed by a ring light that made her look like a mannequin in a department store window. She was giggling. "Baby, you should see her," Julian said, running his fingers along the spine of my father's restoration journal, the one bound in hand-tooled leather that smelled like pipe tobacco and decades of patience. "She treats this thing like it's the Holy Grail. It's a notebook, Vanessa. A beat-up notebook full of instructions on how to glue old wood back together." "That's literally her whole personality," Vanessa said, inspecting her manicure on camera. "Antique lady. It's giving grandma cosplay." Julian snorted. "The journal, the deed to the estate, the whole legacy nonsense. I've already got Moreau and Leon lined up. He'll pay $2 million just for the proprietary techniques alone. We sell the estate separately. That's another 6, maybe 7. We'll be in the Marais by spring, baby." "And what about her?" Vanessa asked, the way you'd ask about leftover takeout. "What about her?" Julian shrugged. "She's 52. She'll get the house in Pasadena, her little workshop, and a story about how her husband outgrew her. Happens every day." He picked up the journal again and fanned through the pages like it was a deck of cards. "Her father spent 40 years filling this thing, and she thinks it's sacred. It's inventory, Vanessa. It's a price list dressed up in sentiment." I stood there. I did not move. I did not cry. Something far more dangerous happened. I went completely still, the way the ocean pulls back before a tsunami. I watched him handle my father's life work with the same casual disregard you'd use flipping through a takeout menu, and every tender feeling I'd ever had for Julian Robert Ashford evaporated like morning fog off the Pacific. I walked back upstairs on silent feet. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the photograph on my nightstand. My father in his workshop, sawdust in his hair, holding up a 17th century music box he'd brought back from the dead. He was smiling the way only a man who loves his work can smile. I pressed my thumb against the glass of the frame and made a promise that needed no words. He will never touch it. Not the journal, not the estate. Not a single splinter of what you built, Dad. I swear it. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal from someone you trusted with your life, please click like. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? I need to know I'm not alone in this fight. I need to take you back. Back before Julian, before the betrayal, before any of this ugliness invaded the life my father built with his bare hands. Because if you're going to understand why I did what I did, you need to know what was at stake. Not just money, not just property, but a promise made between a dying man and the daughter who swore she'd keep his fire burning. My father, William Cross, started Cross Heritage Restorations in 1971 out of a rented garage in Glendale with exactly $400, a table saw he'd rebuilt himself, and a stubbornness that could outlast granite. He was the son of a furniture maker from Bakersfield who never made more than $30,000 a year in his life, and Dad carried that blue-collar grit like a badge of honor. He didn't restore antiques because it was fashionable. He did it because he believed that every handcrafted piece carried the soul of the person who made it, and throwing it away was a kind of murder. I grew up in that workshop. While other girls were at the mall, I was learning to identify dovetail joints by touch and date wood by its grain pattern. By the time I was 16, I could strip and refinish a Georgian mahogany table faster than any of Dad's apprentices, and he made sure I knew it wasn't just a skill, it was a calling. "Amanda," he'd say, pushing his reading glasses up his nose as he examined a cracked violin case from the 1800s. "Anybody can build something new. It takes real character to save something old." When Dad got sick, pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate, I was 29, freshly divorced from my first husband, who'd had the decency to simply be boring, and running the San Marino workshop alone. Dad handed me the journal on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before he died. His hands shook, and the leather was warm from his lap. "Everything I know is in here," he said. "The formulas, the techniques, the client histories. But more than that, sweetheart, it's proof that patience and integrity still mean something in this world. Don't let anyone tell you it's just paper." I held that journal against my chest and promised him I would guard it with my life. He died on a Friday morning in October, and the workshop smelled like walnut stain and goodbye. I didn't open the journal for 3 months. When I finally did, I found a note tucked inside the front cover in his shaky handwriting. "For my Amanda, the wood doesn't care how hard the world gets. It just needs someone willing to be patient with it. Be patient, sweetheart, with the wood and with yourself." I sold my mother's engagement ring that year to keep the workshop from going under. 2 carats, Art Deco setting, the most beautiful thing she'd ever owned. I took it to a jeweler on Colorado Boulevard and walked out with $11,000 and a hole in my chest that took years to fill. But the workshop survived. Then it grew. Cross Heritage became the name that museums called when they had pieces no one else could save. The Getty, the Huntington, private collectors from Napa to Newport Beach. I built that reputation one careful restoration at a time, and every night I went home to a modest house in Pasadena, where the most valuable thing was a leather-bound notebook on my bedside table. Julian Ashford walked into my life at a fundraiser for the Pasadena Historical Society when I was 45. He was 41, tall, silver at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He introduced himself as an investment consultant specializing in cultural assets, and he spoke about heritage preservation with the kind of passion that made my heart do something it hadn't done in years. He asked intelligent questions about provenance and restoration ethics. He remembered details from conversations weeks later. He brought me lilies, not roses, lilies, because I'd mentioned once that my mother had grown them. What I didn't know was that Julian Robert Ashford had arrived in California 18 months earlier with a trail of debt stretching from Atlantic City to Louisville. $400,000 in gambling losses, 2 failed investment schemes, and a reputation in Kentucky financial circles that would have made a con artist blush. He'd changed his last name from Jessup to Ashford because Ashford sounded like old money, and old money was exactly what he was hunting. I married him because I was lonely, and loneliness at 46 is a very specific kind of danger. It doesn't make you stupid, it makes you hopeful. And hope without caution is just a prettier word for reckless. Looking back, I can see every red flag I chose to ignore. Every moment I translated his coldness as sophistication, and his disinterest in my work as respectable distance. I was a woman who could date a chair to the decade by the angle of its legs, and I couldn't see the forgery sitting across from me at dinner every night. That irony doesn't escape me. It keeps me humble. The flag started waving harder about 3 years in, And I know now that I saw them. I just didn't want to. Julian's business trips multiplied like rabbits. San Francisco one week, New York the next, always with vague explanations about client portfolios and asset restructuring. He started coming home smelling like a cologne he didn't own, something sweet and aggressive that clung to his shirts like an accusation. He changed the password on his phone. He changed the password on his laptop. He changed the password on our joint investment account and told me it was a security update. Then, one evening, I came home early from the workshop and found him in my father's study, photographing the journal. Page by page, methodical, clinical. When he saw me in the doorway, he didn't flinch. He smiled. "Just digitizing it for safekeeping, sweetheart," he said. "You should really have a backup." I wanted to believe him. I chose to believe him. Because the alternative meant admitting that the man I'd let into my father's house, into my father's chair, was cataloging the contents of my inheritance like a burglar casing a vault. That same week, Marcus Chen started at the workshop. Marcus was a master carpenter from Sacramento, who'd spent 20 years building custom furniture before pivoting to restoration. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of man who sanded a surface 40 times because 39 wasn't enough. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it meant something. On his third day, he was helping me repair a Civil War-era writing desk when he paused and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You okay, Mrs. Ashford?" he asked, and it was such a simple question that it nearly broke me open. "Fine," I said, "just tired." He nodded slowly, the way people do when they know you're lying but respect you enough not to push. Then he said something that lodged in my brain like a splinter. "You know, I had a guy come through the workshop yesterday, said he was your husband's business associate, asked a lot of questions about the journal, what techniques were in it, whether they were proprietary, how much the formulas might be worth to a competitor. I told him I just started, didn't know anything about it." He paused, wiped his hands on his apron. Seemed like the right answer. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the workshop's drafty windows. I thanked Marcus, kept my voice steady, and went back to the writing desk. But inside, a clock had started ticking, the kind you can't unhear once it begins. That weekend, Grace did something that still makes me smile through the ache. She came into the workshop carrying a shoebox full of broken costume jewelry, plastic pearls, a bent tiara from Halloween, a bracelet missing half its beads. She set it on my workbench with the seriousness of a surgeon presenting an X-ray and said, "Mommy, can we fix these? They're not old like your stuff, but they're important to me." I looked at my daughter, this small, perfect person who understood instinctively that broken things deserve attention. And I thought, Julian will never understand this. He sees a tiara worth nothing. Grace sees something worth saving. That's the difference between a man who prices everything and a child who values everything. And then Grace broke my heart wide open. It was a Thursday evening, 2 weeks later. I came home to find my 10-year-old daughter sitting on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by the miniature dollhouse furniture I'd been carving for her since she was 4. Tiny chairs, a walnut dining table the size of my palm, a rocking horse made from a scrap of reclaimed cherry wood. She was crying the kind of quiet tears that children produce when they've been carrying something too heavy for too long. "Grace, sweetheart, what's wrong?" She looked up at me with Julian's hazel eyes, and what she said next changed everything. "Mommy, is it true that you love the old wooden things more than you love me? Daddy said you're going to sell our house so you can buy more stuff for the workshop. He said we might have to move, and it's because of your old things." The room tilted. I knelt down and pulled her into my arms, and over her shoulder, I stared at the wall and felt something inside me shift from grief to granite. Julian hadn't just betrayed me. He hadn't just planned to rob me. He had poisoned my daughter's heart, dripped lies into her ears like venom, trying to wedge himself between us so that when the time came, when he filed for custody as part of his exit strategy, Grace would choose him. The man I'd married was using my child as a weapon against me. I held Grace tighter and whispered into her hair, Listen to me, Grace Elizabeth Cross. You are my greatest restoration. Everything I do, every single thing, is for you. No piece of wood, no antique, no workshop will ever be more important than you. Do you understand me? She nodded against my shoulder, and I felt her small body relax the way a board does when you finally remove the clamp. Slowly, with relief, as if it had been holding a shape it was never meant to hold. That was the night Amanda Cross stopped being a victim and started being a strategist. I dried Grace's tears. I read her a story, tucked her in, and kissed her forehead. Then I went to my own room, closed the door, and opened my laptop. I did not cry. Crying was for later, or maybe never. Right now, there was work to do. The first call I made was to Rita Espinoza, the best private investigator in Los Angeles County, a former LAPD detective who'd spent 30 years tracking down people who didn't want to be found. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is how you know someone is genuinely dangerous at their job. When I finished, she said 2 words. I'm in. Within 3 weeks, Rita had assembled a file on Julian that read like a crime novel. Julian Robert Jessup, his real name, the one he'd buried under layers of reinvention, owed $1.2 million to various creditors, including a gambling syndicate in Las Vegas that was running out of patience. His investment consulting firm was a shell company with a website, a logo, and exactly 0 clients. Every dollar he'd spent in the past 4 years, the suits, the dinners, the trips, had come from my accounts, siphoned through a series of small transfers designed to stay below the reporting threshold. Rita also confirmed what I already knew in my gut. Vanessa Drake wasn't just his mistress. She was his business partner. They'd been running the same con on a widow in Connecticut 3 years before Julian found me. But the widow died before they could close the deal, and they'd moved to California to find a new mark. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at midnight reading Rita's report, and a sentence jumped off the page that made me set my coffee cup down so carefully you'd think it was made of eggshell. Vanessa Drake had posted a photo on her private Instagram account, the one she thought no one could see, of Julian wearing a Rolex Submariner. Not just any Rolex, a vintage 1965 model with a blue dial. I recognized it because I'd appraised one exactly like it 2 years earlier for a client. It cost $62,000. Julian had bought it with money siphoned from our household account during the same month I was deciding whether I could afford to replace the workshop roof. I'd chosen to patch the leak myself, climbing up there on a Saturday morning with a bucket of tar because I thought we were watching our spending. He was watching his wrist. Armed with Rita's report, I did something that required every ounce of acting skill I'd never known I possessed. I became the perfect, oblivious wife. I smiled at Julian over breakfast. I asked about his business trips with wide, trusting eyes. I even let a little tremor into my voice when he talked about our financial future, as if I were a nervous woman grateful for a strong man's guidance. Inside, I was cataloging every lie, timestamping every deception, building a case so airtight that not even the most expensive divorce attorney in Beverly Hills could crack it. But I needed Julian to incriminate himself, and for that, I needed him to feel safe. So I played the fool. When he suggested moving our investment portfolio to a new, high-yield vehicle, I agreed with a worried smile. When he asked me to sign documents transferring certain assets into a joint trust he'd conveniently established, I signed, but not before photographing every page and having Rita's forensic accountant analyze the fine print. Every document he thought was tightening his grip was actually a noose. The trust documents contained language that, once flagged by a competent attorney, constituted clear evidence of financial manipulation, language Julian had been too arrogant to think I'd ever question. There was one night, the closest I came to losing my composure, when Julian came home late and found me in the workshop. He leaned against the doorframe, loosened his tie, and watched me work on a Chippendale mirror frame with an expression that might have passed for admiration if you didn't know what lived behind his eyes. "You know, Amanda," he said. Sometimes I wonder if you'd notice if the whole world burned down, as long as your little workshop was still standing. He said it like a joke. He said everything like a joke. I looked up from the mirror frame, smiled, and said, "Probably not, but I'd definitely notice if someone tried to set the fire." He laughed. He didn't understand. That was the beauty of it. The hardest part was the nights. Lying next to a man you despise while pretending to love him is a special kind of torture that corrodes you from the inside. Some nights I'd lie awake listening to him breathe and imagine my father's face. The disappointment he'd feel not at my being deceived, but at my staying silent. But I wasn't silent, Dad. I was gathering ammunition. Then I found Julian's real weakness, and it wasn't money. It was shame. A trip to Hazard, Kentucky, population 8,000, median income $23,000, revealed the truth Julian had spent his entire adult life trying to erase. His parents, Earl and Doris Jessup, were still alive. Earl was 78, a retired coal miner with black lung disease, living in a single-wide trailer on a dirt road outside town. Doris was 75, diabetic, partially blind, surviving on Social Security and the charity of neighbors who brought groceries on Sundays. Their son, the golden boy who'd left for college on a scholarship and never looked back, hadn't called in 11 years, hadn't sent money, hadn't sent a birthday card. The last they'd heard, he was doing well in finance out west. I sat in Doris Jessup's kitchen drinking instant coffee from a chipped mug with a faded American flag on it, and I listened to a mother talk about her son with the kind of love that defies all evidence. She showed me his high school football photo, still framed on the wall. She showed me the last Christmas card he'd sent, 2013. She asked me, very quietly, if I knew whether he was healthy. I told her he was. I did not tell her the rest. But I did something I hadn't planned. I wrote a check for $20,000 to the Hazard Community Health Clinic in Earl and Doris's name. Because someone should take care of those people, and their son clearly wasn't going to. Before I left, I asked Doris if I could have a few of Julian's old things: his father's work shirt, a pair of Earl's mining boots, a family photograph from 1989. Doris gave them to me in a paper grocery bag with trembling hands and said, "If you see him, tell him his daddy still prays for him every night." I put the bag in my car, sat behind the wheel, and cried for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Not for myself, for Doris. For the cruelty of raising a son who turned out to be the kind of man who considers his own parents' poverty an embarrassment to be erased, rather than a sacrifice to be honored. I drove back to California with that bag on the passenger seat and a plan crystallizing in my mind like ice forming on a window. Julian made his move on a Tuesday. He came to me with the confidence of a man who believes he's already won, chest out, voice smooth, wearing that patronizing smile I'd grown to detest. "Amanda, sweetheart, I need you to do something important for our family's future." He explained that he'd arranged a meeting with a prestigious heritage foundation in Paris, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to showcase the cross-restoration techniques to European investors. All he needed was the journal, the original deed to the family estate in San Marino, and a notarized letter of provenance. He wanted them packed in the Halliburton briefcase we kept in the study, and he needed them by Friday. "I also need you to transfer $5 million into our joint operating account," he added, as casually as if he were asking me to pick up milk, "for travel expenses and the initial partnership deposit." I let my eyes go wide. I let my lip tremble. I clasped my hands together in my lap and said, "Julian, that's so much money. Are you sure this is safe?" He put his hand on mine, warm, steady, practiced. "Sweetheart, have I ever steered us wrong? This is what I do. Trust me." "I do trust you," I whispered, and I meant it in exactly the opposite way he heard it. That night, after Julian went to bed, I sat in the workshop with Marcus. I hadn't planned to tell him everything, but he'd stayed late to finish a commission, and when he saw my face, he simply pulled up a chair and waited. So I told him. All of it. When I was done, Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My grandfather was a woodworker in Guangzhou. He used to say that the tree that bends in the storm is the one still standing when the sun comes out." He looked at me. "You've been bending a long time, Amanda. Sounds like the storm's about to pass." I transferred the $5 million into an account I'd set up with Rita's help, an escrow account at a bank in Santa Monica that required biometric verification and in-person confirmation for any withdrawal over $10,000. Julian would see the balance on his app and feel rich. He would not be able to touch a dime of it from 6,000 miles away. Then I packed the briefcase. I placed each item with the same care I used restoring a museum piece. But these items were not what Julian expected. Inside the brushed aluminum case, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, I placed Earl Jessup's coal-stained work shirt, folded neatly. Doris's reading glasses, one arm held together with electrical tape. A family photograph from 1989. Earl, Doris, and a 12-year-old Julian standing in front of a trailer with an American flag tacked above the door. All three of them squinting into the sun with the fierce, unyielding pride of people who have nothing but each other. And on top of it all, a letter. On Friday morning, Julian practically bounced into the kitchen. He kissed my forehead, a gesture so transactional it might as well have been a receipt, picked up the briefcase and headed for the door. Grace was eating cereal at the table, and Julian ruffled her hair without looking at her. "Be good for mommy, princess," he said. And the casual cruelty of his performance, pretending to be a father for an audience of one, made my hands tighten around my coffee mug until my knuckles went white. "Back in 10 days, sweetheart. This is going to change everything." "I know it will," I said. He paused at the door and looked back at me with something that might have been suspicion, but his ego was too inflated to let doubt take root. He winked. He actually winked at me. Then he was gone, and I stood in the kitchen listening to his rental car pull out of the driveway, and I allowed myself exactly one deep breath before I picked up the phone. "Rita, he's airborne. Start the clock." Grace looked up from her cereal. "Mommy, is Daddy coming back?" I sat down next to her and took her hand. "Sweetheart, some things are about to change. But you and me? We're the thing that stays the same. Always." He thinks he's walking away with my life's work. Do you think I'm being too cruel by letting him go this far? Or does a man who manipulates his own daughter deserve everything that's coming? Share your thoughts below and comment with the word justice to stand with me. I'm reading every single one of your messages. Paris in October is all amber light and cafe smoke, the kind of city that makes even mediocre people feel important. Julian and Vanessa checked into the Hôtel de Crillon like they owned the place, or rather, like they were about to. Julian had booked the Suite Bernstein, 4,000 euros a night, because nothing says, "I've made it," like spending stolen money in a room where Marie Antoinette once took music lessons. Vanessa documented everything for her Instagram: the champagne, the view of the Place de la Concorde, the marble bathroom with gold fixtures. She captioned it, "Living my legacy life," with a string of crown emojis, which would have been funny if it weren't so grotesque. That evening, Julian hosted a dinner in the hotel's private dining room for a small group of European art dealers and heritage investors he'd been cultivating for months. Men and women in cashmere and silk who spoke in hushed tones about provenance and market value. Julian stood at the head of the table, glass of Chateau Margaux in hand, and delivered a pitch so polished it could have been rehearsed in front of a mirror, which it almost certainly was. He spoke about the cross-heritage restoration techniques as if they were his own invention, dropping my father's name with the casual possessiveness of a man who believes ownership is just a matter of proximity. The journal alone contains proprietary formulas worth millions, he told the table, his voice carrying the warm authority of a man who has never once doubted his right to take what isn't his. The estate in San Marino is a landmark property. Combined, we're looking at a portfolio that redefines cultural asset management. An older woman at the far end of the table, a dealer from Vienna named Margit, who'd been in the art world longer than Julian had been alive, studied him with the quiet intensity of someone who's seen every variety of fraud the industry produces. "And your wife?" she asked. "Mrs. Cross is quite well regarded in restoration circles. She's comfortable with this arrangement?" Julian's smile didn't waver. "Amanda's a traditionalist. She's happiest in her workshop. The business side isn't really her strength. That's where I come in." Margit said nothing, but she set down her wine glass with a deliberate click that, in retrospect, should have sounded like a warning bell. Then the check arrived for dinner. Julian slid my credit card across the silver tray with the confidence of a man signing a peace treaty. The waiter returned 45 seconds later with an expression that could best be described as professionally devastated. "I'm sorry, monsieur. The card has been declined." The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people pausing between courses, but the surgical quiet of people recalibrating their opinion of someone in real time. Julian laughed, too loud, too fast, and pulled out a second card. Declined. A third. Declined. Vanessa's smile hardened into something that looked like the first stage of an exit strategy. "Technical issue," Julian said, loosening his tie. "International banks, you know how it is. I'll sort it out in the morning." He excused himself, pulled out his phone in the hallway, and stared at the banking app that showed $5 million sitting in an account he could see but could not touch, like water behind glass in the desert. He called the bank. The automated system told him that in-person biometric verification was required for all transactions. He called again. Same answer. He called a third time, as if repetition might change the laws of banking. It did not. Back in the suite, Vanessa was already packing a smaller bag within her suitcase. The practiced efficiency of a woman who always plans her exits in advance. "Fix it, Julian," she said, not looking up. "I didn't fly 6,000 miles to be embarrassed in front of people who matter." "I will fix it," Julian snapped. But the crack was showing now. Hairline fractures running through the polished surface of his confidence, like a damaged porcelain vase that someone has handled too roughly. The next morning was supposed to be Julian's coronation. He'd arranged for the investors to meet at a private salon in the Hotel de Crillon, where he would unveil the contents of the briefcase, the journal, the deed, the provenance documents, and close the deal that would fund his new life. He dressed in his best suit. He straightened his tie in the mirror and told himself the man looking back was a success story. He carried the Halliburton briefcase to the center of the room and placed it on the mahogany table with the reverence of a priest presenting a relic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what I'm about to show you represents over 40 years of one family's dedication to preserving our cultural heritage." He clicked open the latches. He lifted the lid. And the room watched as Julian Robert Ashford, born Julian Robert Jessup in a trailer in Hazard, Kentucky, stared down at a coal miner's work shirt, a pair of reading glasses held together with electrical tape, and a photograph of a 12-year-old boy standing in front of a trailer with an American flag above the door. The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of understanding. The kind that settles over a room when everyone simultaneously realizes they've been listening to a fraud. Julian's hands began to shake. He rifled through the tissue paper, pulled out Earl's shirt, held it up as if it might transform into a leather-bound journal if he just looked at it hard enough. A mining boot fell out and thudded onto the mahogany table. Margit, the dealer from Vienna, leaned forward, examined the photograph, and said, very quietly, "That boy in the picture looks quite a lot like you, Monsieur Ashford. Or should I say, Jessup?" Julian's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Then he found the letter. It was written on cross-heritage letterhead, in my handwriting. "Dear Julian, you came into my life wanting to sell my father's legacy to fund your vanity. You called his life's work ancient trash. You tried to turn my daughter against me so you could steal her too. You abandoned your own parents, a coal miner and his wife who gave you everything they had, to rot in poverty while you played dress-up as a rich man. So here is the only legacy you actually own. Your father's work shirt, your mother's glasses, and the family photograph you've been running from your entire life. Your father still prays for you every night, Julian. I know this because I sat in your mother's kitchen and watched her cry when she said it. But I don't pray for you. I don't need to. I just outworked you. With clarity and no regret, Amanda Cross. The investors began gathering their things with the quiet efficiency of people who suddenly remember they have somewhere else to be. One of them paused at the door and looked back at Julian with an expression that was almost pity. Almost, but not quite. Pity requires believing the person deserved better, and no one in that room believed that anymore. Vanessa, who had been watching from the corner with the calculating stillness of a cat near an open window, was already on her phone. What happened next was the final act of a con artist saving her own skin. When the Police Nationale arrived at the hotel 40 minutes later, responding to a detailed report I had filed through my attorney 3 days earlier, documenting the planned theft of proprietary intellectual property and cultural artifacts, Vanessa was waiting for them in the lobby. She had printed screenshots of Julian's messages to her detailing the scheme. She had receipts from the shell company. She had a typed statement describing herself as a victim of Julian's manipulation, who had cooperated under duress. The woman who had called me Grandma Cosplay had rebranded herself as a whistleblower in under an hour. You almost had to admire the efficiency, the way you might admire a cockroach for surviving a nuclear blast. Impressive, but you still don't want it in your house. Julian stood in the Sweet Bernstein in his wrinkled suit, watching 2 officers examine the briefcase full of his father's belongings, and for the first time since I'd known him, he had absolutely nothing to say. No smooth explanation. No charming redirect. Just the hollow stare of a man watching every lie he'd ever told collapse into a single, undeniable truth. "You can't do this," he finally managed, but his voice had lost its polish. It cracked at the edges like cheap veneer peeling off particle board. "Monsieur Jessup," the lead officer said, emphasizing the name on the warrant, "you are being detained pending extradition proceedings to the United States. You face charges of financial fraud, identity fraud, and elder neglect under California and Kentucky state law." "Elder neglect?" Julian repeated, and for one brief, beautiful moment, the mask fell completely. He looked like a scared boy from a trailer in Hazard, Kentucky, except that boy had had a father who loved him, and this man had thrown that love away like the old trash he thought my father's legacy was. Vanessa didn't even look at him as she walked out of the hotel. She was already composing an Instagram story about toxic relationships and knowing your worth. The influencer had influenced her way right out of the wreckage, leaving Julian alone with the consequences of every shortcut he'd ever taken. It was over. Not with a bang, not with a scream. With a letter, a work shirt, and the quiet, relentless precision of a woman who'd spent her whole life learning that the most valuable things are the ones you take time to restore. 3 months later, on a Sunday morning in December, the Pasadena workshop smelled like linseed oil and fresh coffee. Grace was perched on a stool at the workbench, her tongue poking out in concentration as she sanded a piece of reclaimed oak with the careful, circular motions I'd taught her. Beside her, Marcus was applying a coat of tongue oil to a table leg, his hands moving with the patient rhythm of a man who understood that some things can't be rushed. The table they were working on had come from a farmhouse in Kentucky. I'd bought it at an estate sale 3 towns over from Hazard. A simple pine kitchen table, scarred by decades of use, with the initials E.J. carved into one leg by a boy who'd probably gotten scolded for doing it. Earl Jessup's table. I'd brought it back to California and placed it in the center of my workshop, and now we were bringing it back to life. The irony wasn't lost on me, restoring the table that belonged to the family of the man who tried to destroy mine. But that's what we do, the Cross women. We restore things, even the things left behind by people who don't deserve our care. "Mom, look," Grace said, holding up her piece of oak. "It's a I got the grain to show through, just like Grandpa's book says. I looked at my daughter, my fierce, kind, resilient daughter, who had weathered a storm no child should have to face, and come through it with her heart intact. And I felt something settle inside me. Not happiness exactly. Something deeper. Something like the feeling you get when you've been holding your breath for years and finally let it go. Your grandfather would be so proud of you, Gracie, I said, and I meant it down to my bones. Marcus caught my eye over Grace's head and gave me a small nod. The kind of wordless communication that happens between people who've been through something together and come out the other side. He didn't need to say anything. The table said it all. Here was a broken thing, made by the hands of a man whose own son had discarded him, being carefully, lovingly restored by the woman that son had tried to destroy. There's a word for that, but I don't think irony quite covers it. I think the word might be justice, or maybe it's just grace. Julian's case went to trial in February. The fraud charges stuck. The elder neglect charges stuck harder. A jury in Kentucky does not look kindly on a man who let his coal miner father suffocate in a trailer while he drank champagne in Paris. He received 6 years. I hear he writes letters to his parents now. I hope for Earl and Doris's sake that the words are real this time. But I've learned not to trust a man whose native language is deception. The $5 million sits in a trust I established for Grace's education and for the future of cross-heritage restorations. Every penny earned by honest work, protected by honest means. Rita Espinoza sends me a Christmas card every year now. Last year's said, "To the toughest client I've ever had, your father raised a warrior." And the journal, my father's journal, the one Julian called a price list dressed up in sentiment, sits on my workbench where it has always been, open to a random page, still smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and patience. I added a new entry last week, in my own handwriting, between a formula for period-accurate shellac and a sketch of a mortise and tenon joint. December 15th. Restored a pine kitchen table, circa 1965. Kentucky origin. Significant structural damage from neglect. Patient repair using traditional methods. Prognosis. It will hold for another 100 years, at least. Some things, when properly cared for, only get stronger with time. AC. Grace read it and smiled. She picked up her sandpaper and went back to work. Marcus poured more coffee. The Santa Ana winds had stopped, and through the workshop windows, the Pasadena morning was gold and still, and everything breakable in the world felt, for just a moment, beautifully, stubbornly whole. Julian thought my antiques were just old trash, but he forgot that the strongest things in this world are those that have survived the fire and been carefully put back together. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, please like the video and share your own story of resilience in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your strength again. Until next time, stay strong.